Welcome to Strength Chat Podcast, presented by Kabuki Strength. Introducing your hosts, Chris Duffin, the mad scientist of strength, Rudy Cadlow, mature athlete and coach, and the wizard of training himself, Brandon Sen.
Welcome to Strength Chat with your host, the mad scientist of strength, Chris Duffin. That's myself. You threw me totally off with those sound effects, Andre. All right. To my right, we've got our mature athlete and coach, Rudy Cadlow, or Dr. Rudolph, as we call him on the show. And to my left,
the always amusing, always entertaining,
you can just introduce
Brandon
yourself
Sen.
today. There we go. So today, we're really excited to have as our guest, Guido Van Ryssegem. Did I get that right? I hope I did.
Guido
I got
Van
the thumbs
Ryssegem.
up. Yes.
Guido Van Ryssegem.
I was so stressed out about getting your name 100% correct. It threw me off. So, all right. We are really excited to have you on. I had the pleasure of meeting Guido. It was late last year, I think, at Exos. We both were speakers at the Prague School to Athletic Development, and we actually got to work together on the side on a few different things, and it was quite entertaining, and I think both of us learned a little bit from each other, and it was a really good time. So I'm going to give a brief introduction. So Guido works for Oregon State, but he's been in clinical practice for about 30 years and working in the strength and conditioning arena for about 35 or so years. Consults and speaks at a number of different colleges, along with collegiate teams, pro teams. The list goes on. I don't want to spend all day naming off the list of teams that he works on or different types of sports. Maybe you'll jump into that in a second. But Guido also has his own course that he's developed, which is Kinetic Integrations Exercise Certification, and also teaches neurodynamics techniques. So anything I miss in there, Guido?
The other topics are a Proprioception workshop, movement variability workshop, and now my new one for the summer at Perform Better is sensory motor retraining.
Excellent. So, Guido, I guess the question is, to start off, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up coming down the path that you're on now?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit of a unique path. I was a medic for the commandos, special forces there in those days in Belgium for the NATO forces. Did that for a few years. Then wanted to stay in the medical field. There are no athletic trainers in Belgium, not even today. And my mom was a nurse, and I ended up in the ER and trauma center for about 12 years and started falling in love with baseball at a relatively late age. I was about 17 when I saw a movie on TV, and I thought, that'd be pretty cool. And trying to make it very short, but I met a gentleman from the Seattle Mariners during a European baseball tournament. He got me introduced to the Seattle Mariners. I came over about 6 months later, and a year later, my wife and I sold everything we had, and we moved to Eugene, Oregon. Obtained a dual master's degree there in athletic training and sports medicine, and pursued a career in professional baseball with the Kansas City Royals, Texas Rangers, and then eventually with the Baltimore Orioles as medical coordinator. Started applying more and more of the strength and conditioning principles during my rehabilitation and return to play protocols because these guys were strong. They're not regular physical therapy patients. And so I delved more and more into the principles of strength training, and I still learn on a day-to-day basis from then on out. Wanted to return back to Oregon to raise our kids, and ended up at Oregon State University, where I am currently the coordinator of athletic training services in the Department of Recreational Sports. So I'm a consultant for athletics, work with a variety of athletes here that are not necessarily NCAA team, but I'm thinking rugby, ice hockey, triathlon. We have a powerlifting club, ROTC. We have all the three military branches here, which is quite a bit of fun for me to work with some of those individuals. Actually, this week I've been working with a Navy SEAL candidate to help him to prepare to go to Navy SEAL school. Simultaneously, I've set up my own business called Safe Recovery. I'm a part owner of another company called Elevation Fitness. We have about 20,000 exercises in a database, programs, periodized programs, and a full management system. One of our clients is actually the Cincinnati Reds, as also the veteran warriors, so the veterans that came back and have problems with disabilities. So it's pretty fun. And then the last couple of years, been presenting quite a bit worldwide. Spent quite a bit of time in Korea the last couple of years, and was excited to meet you. Of course, I've heard about you when I saw you at Exos.
So tell us what you do in your spare time, Guido.
I'm a bookworm. So anybody that knows me personally, they know that I like to read books. I swing a little bit of a kettlebell around in my office, got some plates in my office. And I'm kind of a Dan John kind of guy, do 5 sets of 15 push-ups, band pulls, and go to rows and overhead presses and squats and front squats and deadlifts and call it a day. I enjoy weightlifting at a recreational level. It makes me feel healthy and could, allows me on doing physical activities at the age of close to 60. And I hope that will never change.
Excellent. Well, I want to tell, a little bit of stories about some of our interaction at Exos, and also give you some follow-up on something that I promised you I would follow up on. So it was just interesting because, our philosophy here, is around, we do a lot of correctives as like teaching and bringing awareness, but we believe that it's not the fix. Like the fix is like finding dysfunction in your movement and moving well to begin with, right? And from that we can load, and that's what we want to do, and that's what we drive home. And but there's a lot of different tools and stuff we mess around with. And at the time, I think you sat in and saw a portion where I was doing some DNS, like rotational pieces on the shoulder. You were engaged by that, and you pulled me aside later and had me do some stuff basically around bring some rigidity back to the abdominal area as an intra-workout piece to deal with back fatigue. And it was really interesting because we had, when I got back home and I was reflecting on it, I'm like, we have a very similar move that we use in practice with some people that have basically, overactive erectors, a lot of hypertrophy there. They're really erector dominant, and we have a lot of times they'll have some, issues with thoracic mobility and stuff like that as a result of it. And we have a movement that we call erector to deal with erector and diaphragm repatterning, and almost identical to what you had shown me. And I started playing around with that with some people that experience, that fatiguing out, that excess blood flow developing, kind of hindering their workouts. And I started experimenting with some of our clients with that and on myself, and definitely saw a huge increase in the ability to get back to training and add more sets and more volume in the workout. And you were talking about your experiences doing that with the Korean weightlifting team?
Yes.
And then the last one was you and I and, oh gosh darn it, I can't think of his name right now.
What's he look like?
Our doctor that works with that's in China right now.
Correct. Craig Liebenson?
No, not Craig.
Dean?
Justin Dean.
And he's doing some skin rolling stuff, and we do a lot of similar type activity, and we actually have some tools that we produce and sell that deal with, that peripheral nerve stuff. And you were doing something very similar with your hands, more of a plucking motion. Anyway, I just found it was really interesting because fundamentally, like, you have a very similar thought process around staying with the basics, moving well, but like a lot of the tools and other stuff that we went through, like, are also, they're not common. There's not a lot of people doing that stuff, and I found that we were doing some very similar things. But do you want to expand a little bit on those two experiences that you were showing me? So one was what you had the Korean Olympic team doing, because you had some interesting stories about their results year over year with implementing that.
Yes, I had the luxury to go to Korea a couple of years ago into the Olympic Training Center as a consultant. they're struggling in a way to compete against the Chinese lifters right now. And so they're looking for other ideas on how to allow their athletes to lift more. So their volume at the end of the day is larger, which means, more reps and more sets. And so one of the struggles that they have, and I see it with a lot of lifters, is what I call the attractor state of the central nervous system is so primed by that posterior chain that the brain, in my opinion, just goes to the default of what is the easiest. And in people that are strong like yourself, it's going to be the erector spinae muscle group. They get then fatigued, get tight. It limits their amount of reps, and it limits their amount of sets, or they need to use more and more rest in between. And so from a standpoint of just observing these athletes, needless to say, I'm not an Olympic weightlifter, but I'm always ready to learn, is that by the end of their workout, they had somewhat of a more powerlifting, protruding anterior core. So their belly pops out. And so immediately I saw the relationship between powerlifting and Olympic weightlifting when they go to ultimate fatigue. And remember, these people are strong. I saw a girl snatching 157 kilos. There's some big, strong people in that group. So by just implying, again, basic principles, do simple things savagely well, I started playing around by getting their anterior core stiff and trying to prime that central nervous system to use the abdominals, the erector the abdominal muscles as a attractor state. And immediately we saw a result within one training session where they're able to add more repetitions and more sets. Their volume went up, and thereby their 1RM axis started to increase. So it's like you said before, people sometimes come up with these fancy dancy things, but I think we often need to go back to the basic principles of weightlifting and the result of that program, and then see if we can change the limitations.
Yeah. I just thought it was interesting applying that in the workout because we use this movement to deal with people with either, with that dominant pattern or back issues as a prep for the workout, but never like, oh, I'm reaching a fatigue state in my workout. Well, let's go back and do it. And when I started doing it myself, I saw an immediate result on the when I was in the state where my workout was failing because I was fatigued in those areas, and it was immediate. I can't tell you when I'm in that state, like the impact that makes, and just that simple thought process of like, let's do it right in the middle of the workout.
Well, I'm actually curious what drill are you guys talking about?
Yeah, what is that?
I know we can visualize that pretty easily. We talk a lot about either pulling the ribs down or other things like that to get the anterior core stiff. But it sounds like you two are talking about a specific drill or technique that you went through.
I'll show you. I'll describe mine because our listener base may be familiar with it, and then Guido can talk about what he showed me, which is very similar. But I use what's on our KMS website, which is the erector diaphragm repatterning drill, where we put the two AccuBalls under the erectors in the sore spot, and we grab the boomstick, and we drive upwards like a small crunch type activity, and then you take and bend and crush that.
So you're essentially
as you drive that.
You're essentially in a dead bug position.
You're in a dead bug, but you're doing a crunching activity to bring rigidity back to this area. Guido had me doing something very similar, braced in a 90-90 pattern against a wall with two dumbbells in each of my hands, driving them up as well. Do you want to describe that, Guido?
Yes. So, like you described, it's a 90-90 position where you push the feet into the wall. I think that's a technique that comes out of Czech Republic for people with low back pain. And the purpose behind that is you're trying to shut off the hip flexors as much as possible, because in a strong individual like Chris, he's just going to have a million compensatory patterns. So you try to shut that off. Considering he's that strong, we need to add a load. And so I gave him two dumbbells, and basically he curls up, trying to isolate his rectus abdominis. And while he's in that curl position, he's somewhat going through a boxing maneuver because I need to add more load to him. In a rehab person, obviously, that's not always necessary. If we would have had more time, I would have played around by actually giving him a barbell with some decent weight. He starts to struggle going actually through a curl maneuver. And so client per client, you need to identify how much resistance do they need to get stiff as soon as possible. And actually, I'm having a collaboration now with a private institution at the University of Oregon called the Bowerman Building, one of the Nike founders. And there's a machine out there, a little tool called Tone. And we're doing some work in Korea now to see if stiffness in other muscles, these are baseball pitchers, can actually facilitate stability in a certain joint and also increase velocity, and if it can prevent injury. And so it'll be really interesting to see with Chris, let's fatigue him through his classic approach, measure the stiffness of his erector spinae, and then make him do these somewhat isometric activities that we just mentioned, and how much stiffness is enough anteriorly for him to feel less fatigued posteriorly, and then be able to train more, meaning more repetitions. That'd be interesting.
So I can tell you when I went back, because we measure velocity on our training sessions, and I would see an immediate increase in velocity with the same weight when I would do the drill and come back. So basically the only difference that I'm doing when I've done it since our discussion was adding 2 AccuMobility balls, which are like a half of a lacrosse ball, one under each erector. They're a little soft, but to get a little bit more release in that tissue, because I don't want to spend as much. I was trying to reduce the amount of time that I was having to do it, and that's a drill we already do that I've had great success with, that causes that area to relax a little fast while doing the crunch with the load. And yeah, it's
So this is a cueing exercise. So you're telling the brain to tighten the abdominals at the same time, loosening the erector spinae.
Well, it's actually really interesting. So we would assume that after you got fatigued, especially for the loading that Chris is doing, that you've used up all of your, usable resources to perform that movement. But I guess what we're saying is that you can actually go back and improve your proprioception or improve your body's awareness of how it actually should be moving once it's reached that fatigue state.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about, I know a lot of your work has been in workshops and stuff has been focused around proprioception. Have you found any other drills such as this and other exercises, or tell us a little bit more about, I guess, the science of proprioception?
All right. Well, that's a whole other ball of wax. But so are we shifting to that presentation?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
Okay, that's cool. So several years ago, I started noticing, especially through social media, that a lot of people were claiming that, let's say, balance exercises, for example, improve proprioception. And then if you look up your balance exercise protocols, the typical stuff that is being done, let's say, in rehab, and you look at the typical proprioceptive exercises, they're exactly the same. So it didn't make any sense to me that one thing was equivalent to the other, while in reality, in my opinion, they're two different things. So, as Chris knows, there's just too much what I call, monkey exercises out there. And often because it's hard, people think it's good. And then we have all these, what I call fads coming through. And so I wanted to have some clarity around all that. So we need to start examining the outcome of our balanced exercise strategies. That's the bottom line. Because I can stand on one foot with my eyes closed for 30 seconds. What the hell does that mean, right? And we need to become more critical around what is balance and what is really proprioception. So that's what I started looking at. So if you look at the history of balance, it basically comes from acrobatics. So if you can ride a bicycle, upside down or whatever, that is pretty much historically what balance or acrobatic techniques are. And then if you look at the history of proprioception, well, it actually comes from rehabilitation, typically called sensory motor rehabilitation. So in the past, this has been kids with polio or any kind of central nervous system disorders or diseases. And those practitioners wanted to come up with a terminology, a word for this, and they went into Latin and they put 2 words together. Proprio is sense, reception is receiving or information. And basically from there on out, this whole thing just took off, and they started adding a verb to it, proprioception or proprioceptive exercises. And from there on out, it's just been crawling around like a freaking octopus that is on steroids. lately proprioception just pops up left and right, and I think it's not necessarily being used in the right context. So that was kind of the start of this whole thing. So later, ankle and ACL rehab professionals started using the phrase proprioceptive exercises, and they assumed, and we still don't know for sure, that we can stimulate so-called damaged receptors. Well, there is no proof for that. So yeah, you sprain your ankle, there is damage to ligaments and so forth. Within ligaments and tendons, there are proprioceptive nerve endings, and they're probably damaged as you damage that whole tissue. But once that is healed or is healing, can we stimulate those damaged receptors? We need to wonder if that's even possible. Then the problem continued on as so-called proprioceptive exercises emerged out of the rehab session, and were starting to get applied with healthy populations and athletes. So, like ladder drills improve your proprioception. Really? Can we even stimulate receptors that have not been damaged at all? I mean, or are we just having the blind leading the blind, and we're calling some fancy terminology, but in reality, we might be completely on the wrong path. So the problem is that balance and proprioceptive terminology, as also exercise, is used interchangeably, and I think that is not the thing to do. Now, researchers often apply balance tests to so-called proprioception. So if you do a review of literature, you're going to find a slew of researchers that claim that proprioception improved after an intervention standing on a, for example, a Bosu ball, but in reality, they were measuring balance. Well, and then if you look at their population, they were either sedentary or actually healthy populations, but relatively sedentary. Well, all four of us know that if you throw a wet towel at somebody, you're going to improve in something too.
Yep.
And so no matter what you do with a sedentary population, you will see some improvement of something. But what the heck does that mean with the populations that you and I are working with? It might mean absolutely nothing.
It means that whoever wrote it was able to do a study and publish that they made a change, and now they've got a nice fancy published study, right? So looks good for
that's
them.
What it is.
It's a feather in the cap.
Yeah. So the bottom line for me, and not only myself at this moment, because more people are digging into this, is that balance is a skill. And like we know, any skill can improve. So yes, standing on your foot with your eyes closed, you're going to suck at it in the beginning, and if you practice it, you're going to get better at it. Just like anything else that we practice. We practice the violin, we're going to get better in playing the violin. And in my opinion, proprioception is a sense. And now we need to wonder, can senses really improve? So smell or taste, for example. Can we improve smell? Can we improve taste? Now, some people, when I present this at an audience, they go, hey, hold on a minute here. I took a weekend wine tasting class, and now I can taste, oaky flavor, cherry flavor, whatever, right? And I go, sure, you can start to differentiating those flavors because the instructor told you. So you make a neural representation based on a word. So you sip the wine, and the instructor says, do you taste this oaky flavor? Well, for all four of us, that's somewhat different, right? Whatever is oaky for us is completely individually different. But if you then associate it with a taste, then yeah, you've learned something. So the next time when you expose yourself again, of course, you can remember that. But it doesn't mean that the sense is improving. It just means your skill to differentiate flavors has improved. And I think that's a whole other ball of wax. The worst part is, although we've gotten a lot smarter with research and so forth, we're still seeing videos and people doing crazy stuff like standing on a physio ball and another platform and then doing a lat pull down and whatever. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier. Some of our professionals, unfortunately, think if a task or a lift or whatever is different and it's difficult, then it's got to be a good thing to do. And it doesn't mean that it's actually is. So right now, there's a bunch of people that believe that proprioception is actually factor to improve balance. The proprioception can be improved through proprioceptive exercises, and a balance exercises also improve proprioception. So now I'd like to delve in what is really balance and what is really proprioception, and if they have a relationship, and what is it. So in 1941, the military here in the U.S. was preparing to put 3.1 million young soldiers through boot camp, and they wanted to come up with a very simple test, because it's expensive to take these kids through boot camp. And they came up with the balance standing test, believe it or not, 1941. And here's the scary part. In 1941, the average American male, young male, that was not physically active during their job, they were not farmers, they were not ranchers, they weren't pulling heavy boxes out of a truck or out of a ship, they could do a standing balance test with their eyes closed for 30 seconds. Now, when I do this demo, it's a test, with any audience that I work with, the majority cannot do this cannot even do it for 10 seconds. So we're seeing a change between the population of 1941. Even those that weren't lifting weights were probably a lot more physically active than the average young male. And we're seeing a deterioration of just a simple balance test. Those that did physical activities on a farm, work-related, they could do it on average for a minute, and athletes were able to do that on average for 2 minutes. So from a population standpoint, and we all know, the four of us know that the average young male and female is not moving anymore, we're seeing a change in how people can do a very simple thing like a balance test. But we really don't know for sure yet at this point if this is any relationship to proprioception. But Dan John also mentioned that balance, and there's studies done with old people, they start losing that just standing on one foot with their eyes open in their scenario. Their capacity to overcome challenges like stepping on and off stairs, et cetera, starts to get diminished, and that actually their life cycle, their amount of years to live, starts to get decreased. So balance is definitely important. Now, if you look at the classic literature of balance, it's basically a static position, right? You stand on 1 foot or 2 feet or whatever. Well, we need to be able to move, so we need to start realizing that balance is actually an activity. That where we need to be able to control our center of gravity over our center of pressure, and it needs to be dynamic, it needs to be variable, especially if you're an athlete, and it can also be position specific. So like yourself, Chris, if you're a power lifter, well, then you need to have good balance, or you need to be able to control that very well while you're doing your specific activities. Mm-hmm. So the balance, one of the first things that I expose people to, and that's often an eye-opener for them, and they start realizing that, holy crap, maybe I need to do something about this. So I prefer to call balance, the activity, I prefer it to be called postural control, because in reality, it's controlling your posture over a variety of challenging situations, depending your sport or your activity you're involved in. We need to be able to hold it during specific postures. Even the soccer player will be stationary at some point between postures as we're shifting from left to right, let's say. And then also we need to be able to control it when we're exposed to perturbations. So if I'm a basketball player and somebody runs into me and I see it coming, then I need to be able to have some control mechanisms to not fall down and be knocked over. But I also need to be able to control this if they attack me from the back and I don't see it coming whatsoever. So it needs to be reflexive. And in reality, that means we need to train our central nervous system and expose us to these activities. Otherwise, we'll never be able to be good at it, just like anything else, just playing like the violin. So it needs to be conscious through a feed-forward mechanism. I see it coming. I know what's going to be required of me. And then it needs to be reflexive if the activity is actually coming at us without us noticing, like a tackle in soccer from behind.
So let's, if we could, just for our listeners that may be just tuning in and haven't heard the first part of this, I mean, I think we kind of understand what balance is and how you measure it, and the balance test is a good one. But I don't know that we've defined, how do you define proprioception? And to take that one more step, you said that's kind of a noun and you've used it as a verb, but what is if that's a proprioception, what's that defined, and what is a proprioceptor?
Yep, that's what we're delving in now.
Okay.
So proprioception, there are several definitions within the literature. So here's kind of the challenge to begin with. There's a couple of research facilities that worldwide have their own definitions. So until relatively recent, a lot of research institutions were not necessarily communicating with each other, but they were looking at the same problem, and in this case, proprioception. So there's a couple of definitions that are similar but not exactly the same. So basically, there's about two major categories of what proprioception is. And the first one says it's the ability to know where a joint is in space and the ability to reposition a joint to a previous experienced position. So in an Olympic weightlifter, that's going to be critical if you're doing an overhead snatch. You need to know exactly where your barbell is, or if you're dealing with kettlebells, and you need to be able to control the joints that are trying to manage that activity. When I was in baseball, it became crucial that I started realizing that ball release had to occur in a specific position at a specific timing. And so as I was working with guys trying to return back to pitching, I started noticing that they were spending almost a year and sometimes longer to relearn to throw. And so the rehab of their, let's say, rotator cuff and labrum surgery was actually quite simple. That's about a 6-month process. But then they had to relearn to throw, and they had no clue where to release that ball again. So I started measuring ranges of motion and taped it on a mirror in the bathroom. There was no fancy equipment there. Again, keep simple things savagely well. And they had to be able to reposition their elbow angle, their wrist angle, their shoulder angle. And actually what we saw when they did that consciously, we were speeding up the time for them to start throwing at maximum velocity. Now, again, this concept, of course, can be applied to any kind of athlete or any kind of activity. If Chris doesn't know where the hell the bar is, he's in deep trouble.
No, I've dealt with this with a number of like elite level athletes that had to take time off from injury, and they're like, I forgot how to bench. Because
Absolutely.
they did all these things naturally, but they didn't know what they were doing. And then after spending a year or two off trying to get back into it, they're like, I forgot this stuff. So because they didn't have a specific sequence, and they had to kind of relearn it. But you could speed up that process by, if you had a really good coaching, cueing, sequencing, and bringing awareness to, where they're supposed to be tight, soft, and positioning and all this stuff into place. All of a sudden they're like, oh, now I remember. And
exactly.
Yep.
I call it the aha moment.
Yep, exactly.
You go, aha, now I remember.
Yep.
Yeah. So the other definition that some add is the ability to detect motion at a joint, and we often call that joint position sense. And again, as just one example, the Olympic weightlifter, of course, it's critical. Other added muscle sensory information, so perception of joint movement and velocity. So proprioception is not static. A joint position sense comes back here in their definition, and muscle tension and length change. As an experienced lifter when that length is at its max. When that length is too short, and you apply your techniques to optimize that length again. And how much muscle tension you can handle and what you can handle. And then again, somewhat what I refer to as changing the attractor state with this modified sit-up technique that we did has been of help to you. And I'm really happy that I was able to contribute to that.
Yeah, no, that's been great. So,
the one other question I had is what are the proprioceptors and where are they located in the joint?
Right. This is another big challenge. So, proprioceptors are things like muscle spindle and Golgi tendon organs. There's a variety of other ones. Now, if you look at the literature and you start reading up on what are their specific functions, then typically we are under the assumption that they have a specific function. So Golgi tendon organ does one thing, muscle spindle does the other thing, and so forth. But the last couple of years, we've noticed in the literature that actually there is quite a bit of overlap of activity. We can't really isolate things, just like we can't isolate certain muscles and certain exercises. We can bias certain muscles to be stiff, but that's probably about it. So if you delve into those proprioceptors, then you can basically see that some of them are, like the Ruffini receptor endings, are active mostly during static joint positions. Golgi tendon organs are very active during they're very inactive during static joint positions, but they're very active during movement of joints. Persinion corpusculosus are active during acceleration and deceleration, free nerve endings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I won't bother you with that. But my whole proprioceptive exercise protocol has been basically based on let's identify which one of those receptors are not doing their job optimally. And now we're going to bias your exercises by actually augmenting them. So certain exercise will be done in a static position if that is what you're lacking. Certain exercise will be done in very dynamic activity because that's what you're lacking. And then delving deeper into the Golgi tendon organs, I came up with something really, really cool, and I think Chris is going to get excited about this. One of the receptors that we have the most evidence on that we can actually bias is the Golgi tendon organ, and how? During heavy weightlifting. Here we go. Now, here we go. We can look at the literature in old people, even elderly. We expose them to a weightlifting program, even if it's tiny little dumbbells, but they're doing something. They're overloading some muscles. Their balance improves. Their sense of being in control of their body starts to improve. So from the day we can start exposing ourselves to load, even if it's just gravity, if we're just 6 months old, we need to increase the amount of loading on any individual, female, male, whatever future activity or career they want to go in through. We need to start getting serious about adding that to our daily repertoire, and that's basically weightlifting. And why would that be? It is because the stiffness that you feel post-lifting, that is augmenting the muscle spindle sensitivity. So now it can faster react to any perturbation in all the states we just discussed. And we know for a fact, although there's not a lot of proof, that in strong individuals like Chris, although in the laboratory the stiffness might only continue for 2 hours post-exercise, in people like Chris and any trained individual, that stiffness lasts a lot longer. So if Chris gets a terrible flu and he needs to go to bed and he can't weightlift for 72 hours, his arms and his legs are not going to look like a wet noodle. They are still stiff. And so there is more and more evidence now that increasing load during weightlifting on a almost day-to-day basis is probably the best thing for a lot of stuff, including balance.
That's really interesting. And, you know, to me, that's one of the kind of life philosophy points I like to try to hit home, because it's not just lifting. If you look at anything, as human beings, we adapt to stress. And it doesn't matter whether it's physical, mental, emotional. Like, if we're going to change, that's part of the evolutionary process. That's part of, being a human being. You've got to have some sort of stress to cause an adaptation, right? And That's where, we can do a lot of these other smaller things, and they can be useful, but understand how they're useful. And at the end of the day, if you want to drive change, you need to apply stress. You need to apply load, right? And, sorry, just got to throw that in there because I like to.
Well, there is more to it than just this nerve ending scenario.
Oh, no, I love the science behind what you're going through. I just I wanted to just digress for a little bit.
So the brain is receiving information from these proprioceptors. Have you found that that by going through these exercises, we're actually being able to control the proprioceptors or improve them consciously, or is it entirely involuntary?
Well, the evidence shows that at least the Golgi tendon organ we can influence in the laboratory for a short time, and I believe in real individuals that train for a much longer period of time. And that's exciting that, anybody should do some strength training. That's the bottom line, and is going to improve balance and all kinds of other stuff. And then research has shown that actually structural brain changes have been measured. So gray matter increases after motor training. Now, they didn't do specifically balance exercises, but any kind of load, there is obviously, besides the structural change within the musculoskeletal system, there's a change within the brain. And so now there is more capacity for the individual that has been engaging in weightlifting or similar activities to actually tap into that brain and so there's a carryover effect to other activities, including their sports, their daily life, and so forth. So although the central nervous system has has a limited capacity for attentional focus, we focus on one thing at the same time, we can bias the brain by doing specific exercises.
So that explains why I've gotten so much smarter since I started powerlifting.
That's right. No, that's just because you're hanging out with me and you absorb it through osmosis. That's it.
Well, the funny part is this: if any of us do activities that challenge us on a physical level, so you learn a new technique, you apply a new piece of equipment, all your brain is doing is problem solving and optimizing, I should say, the movement pattern. And there's a direct carryover effect to your cognitive problem-solving skills. Mm-hmm. So that's quite interesting, right? So you've never used a Viper before. You start using that in your weightlifting techniques, and you're in the beginning struggling with that, and you optimize it as you practice more. And we expose you now to a cognitive, like a crossword puzzle activity. You're actually better in solving those tasks as well. So another reason that's my other topic, movement variability, is important not only for our physical but also our mental capacity.
So you said something just a minute ago that I think answered my question, but I'll ask it anyway. When we're talking about proprioceptive and changing the state at which we're acting, how much of a stimulus does it actually take to see changes in proprioception? So we talked about Chris earlier in doing the 90-90 drill, and that seemed, I'm sure you did it for maybe 30 seconds a minute, something like that.
Was he probably had me do it for better than a minute, I think.
Yeah.
It was,
Even in training sessions here?
In training sessions, I'm probably doing it about 30, 45 seconds.
And what you just said was it needed to be challenging. So is that what we're looking at is a challenging stimulus to actually see changes in proprioception, or is it enough to just go through the action of those joint mechanics or otherwise?
I believe it needs to be a challenge. So for a grandmother, this might be, a modified sit-up if she was very sedentary, post back surgery, for example. But I need to see a result. Now, it's still quite subjective. That basically means I kept asking Chris, tell me when you start feeling stiff in your abs. And that's going to be the same question I'm going to ask Grandma, but I want to adapt the exercise. So I like to call it, I change his central nervous system attractor state. So he stands up, and I'm asking, you still feel stiff, right? He goes, yes, I do. Perfect. What is probably happening, although there's not a lot of evidence, is that his attentional focus is now on that stiffer part. And in this case, we kind of offloaded his back, and we're augmenting or we're biasing his abs. And sometimes, like you mentioned before, Brandon, I might actually cue them by saying, bring your ribs to your hips, as you've just previously mentioned. If I see that they are not engaging it as they're doing the lift. I'm doing similar drills with pull the bar apart. Some of the people that I work with return to lifting, they have a hard time getting their lats going again. And as they're squatting and deadlifting, I want that lat on. So we're doing some stationary isometric positions to get their pec going post, let's say, pec rupture. I worked with a power lifter, which unfortunately I can't say his name, but a couple of years ago, he ripped his right pec off his humerus in his chest and had surgery, and he had a really, really hard time to re-engage that right pec. And so I make him do isometric compressions like this. I hope you can see it on the video. Yeah. And I actually demoed that as well. I don't know if you were there, Chris, if you saw that. But I want some stiffness in those pecs before he starts to bench press. And that's why I love to work with people like Chris. They're so easy to modify because they're strong. They learn fast, and they get it, And my rehab population is quite a bit more of a challenge because they often don't understand what that means. They don't know what it should feel like. Chris felt it immediately, and now it's just great to hear that he applies it even between his sets, and then hopefully, it'll benefit him.
Yeah, that's something that you said it exactly, and it's something that we talk about all the time in our seminars or when we're actually teaching developmental movements with individuals is you have to be intentful with those movements, and that's what you just said. You said that you had to bring a conscious awareness to the change that you were trying to make, and that's the exact same approach that we take.
Yeah, you just can't go through the motions.
No.
It doesn't work that
It
way.
has to be hard, which is also why single-minute exercise prep exists.
Exactly.
SMEP.
Yeah, the attentional focus is going to be key for a multitude of reasons. First of all, you're going to prime yourself. You're getting yourself ready to do the task, number one. And again, people like Chris just does this automatically. Not always the populations I work with. I have to actually teach them what that is. And there is, if you've been exposed to an emotional state, you've been assaulted, you were raped, you were present when your wife had a baby. I don't need 10,000 hours to practice that, right? And so the power lifter especially needs to overcome the feeling of fatigue, load, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd love to see research studies on Chris and his brain versus, let's say, an Olympic weightlifter. Is there a difference, or is it the same? Because if Chris is not on, he's not lifting the weight up. It's as simple as it is.
Oh no, it's crazy the difference if I don't get in the right mental state. I mean, I'll barely lift a weight, and then I can get in the right mental state, and seriously, I can add 100 pounds and do a double or triple. Mm-hmm. Like people can't grasp that it can be that dramatic. Between just like going out there to just go through some movement and like adding purpose, intent, and getting in the right mental state and some visualization and adding all that together, what that can do.
So for our lifters that are listening who use velocity, this is one of the primary reasons that I usually don't recommend that beginner lifters, intermediate lifters actually use velocity on warm-up sets, because more often than not, they're not going to try quite as hard as they would on a heavier working weight. So some of that feedback could be altered, and then that's just going to start a snowball effect of either emotions of, oh, I don't have it today, or what have you. So, yeah, I guess the bottom line is you have to actually try.
Yeah. So
and gripping the bar and gripping the ground, all those things. And that's why I'm a big fan of Nick Winkelman's work. He's an ex-student of mine. He's just recently finished his PhD on cueing. And interestingly enough, he looked at elite sprinters and using an internal cue, so something like, move your legs as fast as possible or push your foot into the ground. So you use a body part to give a cue versus an external cue. Take off like a rocket, something like that. And what he found with the elite sprinters is that actually the non-cueing, as also the external cue, even at their level, was superior. And so Nick and I were speculating that elite athletes, like Chris, they don't need another cue. They know what it takes to put it all on. Chris uses a cue that gets him what I call stiff enough to overcome the load that he's trying to overcome.
So interesting. I'll just throw this out there for food for thought for you to digest. But, in our cueing, we don't even call them cueing strategies anymore, because we actually don't cue the lift at all. Because we were reflecting on this, like so for each of our lifts, we have what would normally be called cues, and we have 5 of them. But they're all prior to lifting. They're all about creating tension in the body. And we start, right here, usually, depends on the movement.
Here being the core.
My core, for listeners, sorry. But everything is in preparation, and then we create tension through the entire body in the appropriate sequence. So we call it now our loading sequence.
Load tensioning
sequence, because that's how we create tension in the body in a specific sequence. And then when it comes to do the lift, you just do the lift. Like, there is no cue. It's the final stage is, okay, now, take the bar down and press it up. Okay.
It's just doing a simple thing savagely well.
Exactly. So once you've got the tension, we don't cue anything at all during the lift, and we found that highly effective. So,
yeah, even just a simple word in the return to lifting, I use like up.
Yep.
It's let the brain figure it out what that means.
Yep.
I think if we use too many words, then they pay attention to try to basically analyze what we're saying.
Yep.
Yeah,
and
you end up with
they're going to try to create a relationship with that. And then unfortunately, with a lot of them, it's the wrong relationship, and you don't see good result.
right. You end up with paralysis by analysis, right?
Absolutely.
We've only got a couple more minutes, and I just want to hit on another topic really quick, and that is in regards to well, Justin was doing skin rolling. We filmed the videos on my YouTube channel that wants to look it up, but you can look it up under Justin Dean's name or Guido's name. Both of their names are in the title. And they're both showing different but similar techniques in dealing with, one, finding areas in the skin where we've got a little bit more tonicity in the skin. But in this video, both of them were able to provide me more spinal extension through doing nothing more than touching my skin. And we do a lot of stuff now with basically that peripheral nervous system, or dealing with that skin-fascial relationship. Do you want to talk just a couple minutes on that?
Yes, it was quite coincidental that Justin and Dr. Schnell, the chiropractor out of Portland, were bringing forward a technique that they developed, and they call it yapping.
Yapping.
Yeah, and how there is a relationship between this manual therapy technique and the release of tension in peripheral nerves. And so I've been using a similar technique, as you saw, for years. I just never thought about calling it something. I mean, I have been calling it something. They call it plucking, but I've never thought about, like commercializing this. So, yeah, I think it's fantastic. They bring this forward. At something as simple as that can bring tremendous results in people with pain, in people with increased stiffness, like yourself, the heavy weightlifter, the power lifter, the Olympic weightlifter, the sprinter, et cetera, et cetera. And that in very few seconds, you can make a big difference. A lot bigger difference, I think, than, let's say, foam rolling and so forth, which I'm not necessarily a tremendous fan of. I think it's just a lot of wasted time. This can accomplish a lot more, but unfortunately, you need a person with hands to make it happen for you. So there is very little evidence, I should say, on how this works on a scientific level, but clinical evidence in the three of us, and now more people are using it, is so substantial that, the athletes that I work with, they go, I don't give a rat's ass about the research. This is making me feel a lot better, and I recuperate faster, et cetera, et cetera. So it's, again, for me, a technique to change the attractor state, to decrease the stiffness in certain areas that are being either caused by training repetition, I should say, activity repetition, pitchers always, throwing with the same hand in the same direction, as also people with pain or after pain, surgery or not. And I hope they really keep pushing this forward, because it's a fantastic technique with great results.
Yep. Thanks for touching on that, Guido. We're getting close to wrapping it up, so we should probably make sure that we touch on the courses. You've got some coming up.
Yep. Right now, I'm getting ready to go back to South Korea. That's the end of March 25th and 26th, for a workshop on proprioception, actually, in Seoul. In April 8th through the 22nd, I do my kinetic integration certification workshop at Oregon State University. April 15, 16, I'll be in Portland State University, a chiropractic school, on movement variability, my other workshop. June 24th, 25th, I'll be at Kenshaw State in Georgia University. July 1st and 2nd, back in Seoul. July 28th, 29th at Chicago, Perform Better, which I'm really pumped about, that Chris Poirier has approved my new topic, sensory motor retraining. Can we bias the brain to focus on one thing versus another? And I think we can. And how does that help performance? How does it help rehabilitation? And then mid-August, I'll be about 12 days at Seoul again at the Cha University, where I'm a professor and do a summer workshop there.
Okay. Where can people find these courses at?
Go to Facebook and they type in Kinetic Integrations. They will see that posted, and they can also see them posted on the kineticintegrations.com website.
Okay. And people find you on social media as well?
Yes, I don't go all too crazy on social media. I just don't have a lot of time. But Facebook is the main thing to follow, and that automatically generates a what is it called? Facebook versus Twitter message. But there's only so much time, and I want to keep doing simple things savagely well.
Good.
Excellent.
And so the Facebook page is Kinetic Integration.
Kinetic Integrations, yes.
Okay, great.
That last quote was the best, but I think we had a better one today. I think we can leave our listeners today with the idea of proper cueing. You can't
Make chicken salad out of chicken shit.
you can't make chicken salad out of chicken shit. So cue your lifters and athletes properly. We're going to keep that one with us.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much, guys, for this opportunity.
Yeah.
Thanks for the time today. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so
problem.
much.
Thanks for joining
Chris,
us.
you come to OSU, you let me know, right?
I will for sure.
We'll be down there.
We're down
pretty
there
quick. Yeah.
So
Perfect. All right, guys. Thanks a bunch.
All right.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Take care.